All right, so for this quick lesson, we're going to be talking about decomposing functions. So basically, we're going to be working backwards. I'm going to give you what the composite function is, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me what was the input function, and then what function was it inputted into. So when you're decomposing, you're breaking those pieces back apart. The thing about this, though, it is very subjective because you could potentially make multiple different f of x's and g of x's that would create the same create the same composite function h of x. Now, these are just labels. So like right here, I have h of x. A lot of times I like to label the output that you're getting the h of x, so like your final answer. But just make sure you read it thoroughly to know what it's talking about. So looking at this example, it's telling me that my final answer here, okay, is x plus 3 squared. So it's asking you what would be the inside, what would be the outside. So the first thing I see is the easiest to kind of visualize is that this is the inside. This is what we are inputting into our problem. So if that's what we're putting inside, then that means that if we were to take it away, the outside would have to be that x squared value. All right, and then we also, if we know that that was the inside, then our g of x would have to be x plus 3. And again, there is multiple ways that you could define these pieces. So when I'm looking at them, I could potentially also say, okay, my input value this time is going to be just the x function. So I could say that my input is going to be just x, and I'm inputting it into the function x plus 3. Now, I will say this, that is one of the last resorts that it's the easiest to just jump right to and say that the function is x. For your assignment today that you're going to be doing, I do not want to see that option, okay? All right, so when I'm looking at the next one, so I have h of x is 1 over x minus 5. So we need to figure out what our input and our output values are. So if I'm looking at it, one of the first things that I would jump to is I would say, okay, I have this whole piece at the bottom. I have x minus 5, okay? So that would be my input. So what would the function have to be if I took that out? So we would just be left with 1 over x. So my original function, my f of x, let me move that over, would have to be 1 over x, and therefore my input, g of x, will have to be x minus 5. Again, you could also use that x value, but for this particular one, I'm going to leave it as is. All right, so for the c function, I have x plus 2, that would be my input. And if that's my input, that means that my g of x is going to be x plus 2. And therefore the output, or not the output, the one that you were inputting in, the f of x, would have to be the square root of x. And then finally, when I look at this one, I have x minus 2 and x minus 2. Those are both input values. So that's going to be my g of x. And then my f of x, if I have those pieces and I take them away, will be x squared minus 4x plus 5. All right, so a couple more examples. If I'm looking at this example, h of x. So I'm looking for what would be the input. So let's say that this was composed. So f of g was composed by plugging the g into the f. So make sure that you pay attention to that, because that's going to make a big difference. If I say that h of x was composed using g of f of x, how we define are going to be very different. So my input for this one would be f of x. So we're talking about my input value. So I can actually do this a couple of different ways here. So I could start by saying that this is my input. I think that's probably the most obvious. So my input would be 2x plus 9. So that means that it was going to be input into the g function this time, which would just be x squared. That's one option. All right, so another option, if I take this back, I could say, well, what if I don't put in this whole thing, but I just put in the 2x? So I could say that my input value this time would just be 2x, so that would leave me the other pieces on the outside, which would be x plus 9 squared. So there's, again, when I said it was subjective, that means that you could make these decisions in multiple different ways, because you could still perform that same composition with using different functions for your input values into the other when you do the composition. All right, so again, here's another one. So this time I'm going to say that h was developed by doing f of g of x. So they want to know what would be your f and your g. So my input value is my g function. Okay, so I have a few options here. I could say that this was my input value. So I could say that 4x squared minus 1 is my input. So that means that the whole thing left over is my output, which would be 1 over the absolute value of x. That's the first option. All right, so another option could be that I just do the 4x squared. So I could say g of x equals 4x squared. So that's going to leave me to input it into the f function, which is going to be 1 over the absolute value of x minus 1. Okay. And I actually see a third option. And that third option would be just to say, all right, to use this whole piece, not just the x minus 4 squared. So that whole piece, so my input would be the absolute value of 4x squared minus 1. So that means that I'm going to input it into the f function, which will be 1 over x. So we have 3 different options that would produce the same composition. And when we decompose it, we have multiple different ways. So if it's multiple choice, there's only going to be one that works. But if I'm asking you to actually analyze it, then some of you may come up with different answers than others will. So just keep that in mind, but they always that is always a good option for any type of test, is looking at it in a reverse option, which is